Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Carlin with UNEP-FI. We're very excited to welcome you to our webinar today for the Asian region about the TCFD, the work that we're doing here at UNEP-FI, as well as some regulatory developments around the world that we think are relevant not only in the region, but also that will have the potential to affect business during and post COVID. We have a really great program for you. We have a series of speakers that will not only outline those programs, but also kind of contextualize the work that UNEP-FI is doing in this space, and hopefully leave you both with a better understanding of that work, as well as some thoughts for you and your institution. And so to kick us off and with the introduction, I'll give it to Mr. Eric Usher, the head of UNEP-FI, to say some words just about the connections between the COVID crisis and the climate crisis, how they relate, and the importance of where we go from here. Eric, I think you're muted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now, Eric. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Excuse me. Okay, sorry, technological challenges. Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for connecting on this very important topic. First of all, of course, we hope everyone is safe and doing okay, I can say, under the circumstances. This crisis has been challenging all aspects of the way we operate, from our health systems, but far beyond, in terms of how we all do our jobs and live our lives. Certainly what we know is that the pandemic has shown the sensitivity of human societies to natural phenomena. Done it in dangerous ways, and whether it's from ecosystem destruction to climate change. The UNEP, we put out a Frontiers report back in 2016, and that found that 60% of all known infectious diseases in humans are zoonotic. Those types of diseases that are transmitted between vertebrate animals and people. Now, the transmission pathways of diseases for animals to humans are not entirely clear, but never before have so many opportunities existed for pathogens to pass from wild and domestic animals to people. What we do know is that the health of our planet plays an important role in the spread of zoonotic diseases. And we're hearing a lot of discussion about the need to build resilience in the face of the crisis. And this concept certainly goes way beyond health systems, and specifically how we manage infectious diseases. For a longer-term sustainability, we need to build system-wide resilience to all future shocks. And this building has to happen before the worst of the crisis hits. Financial regulators rebuilt the financial system after the global financial crisis in 2008. The health systems will surely get rethought after COVID-19. But for climate change, the largest shock which we're already starting to see happening, we need to really plan forward. We need to flatten the curve before, not during, the worst of the crisis. This means we need a green recovery today that has the next crisis in mind. Now, the financial community has a really important role to play in facilitating that recovery, and as such, has a key role in ensuring that it follows on this more sustainable path. And part of that certainly is having a better understanding of climate risks and opportunities. And this is what the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, is all about, and what will enable the financial system to operate efficiently, effectively in pushing this green transition. Thank you. David, back to you.
Thanks so much, Eric. Really important, as you mentioned, to think about not only what has gotten us here, but also the path that we decide to pursue out of this. There's a real recognition, and I think that it's been shown in the industry that time is of the essence, and that the work that was building in momentum will need to continue in many cases, even at a faster pace. And I think that's probably a really good way to lead into just a broader overview of our climate programs here at UNEP-FI, with the recognition that really these climate programs that we're thinking about attempt to integrate a variety of different aspects. So questions of risk and disclosure around the TCFD, alignment, as well as adaptation and resilience. And we think that it's critical to think about all of these components, because in the green future that we're looking toward, it will be the institutions that are not just working on some of these, but all of these in a systematic and integrated way that are really going to be effective. And so one of the ways that we're interested in pushing the industry forward is through the pilot programs that we lead and through the overall climate initiative that is led by Remco Fischer. And I'll let him speak and say more about the overall program before we, of course, dive a bit deeper into the specifics of the TCFD programs themselves.
Morning, David. Good morning, everyone. This is Remco here. I hope you can hear me. Thank you also very much from my side to everyone for joining this webinar. Thanks to our membership and networks in Asia for this. As you've said, David, really the main aim of this webinar is to give an update on the work that as at UNEP-FI we continue carrying out on the TCFD. The TCFD being, just for everyone to understand, the recommendations or the framework of recommendations of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. You'll hear a lot of detail about this throughout this webinar, but just in terms of framing it a little bit, this is work that started in 2017, pretty much immediately after publication of the recommendations by the task force. It is work that to date has brought together close to 80 financial institutions to collaborate in the development of really first generation type sets of risk assessment methodologies for the finance sector that respond to the TCFD. These 80 financial institutions come from across the various financial constituencies that we convene as UNEP-FI. So we have groups of banks doing this, and you'll hear more about this today from David. We have a group of 22 insurance companies doing this. You'll hear more about that from Manuel. And we've also had investors convene and do work on this in the past. All of this work has, over the last 3 years, led to the publication of 3 really landmark reports on these issues, on the methodologies that have been either developed or furthered. And so, broadly speaking, publications about TCFD adoption in the finance sector. In the work today, you'll hear more about the work on the banks, and here we have 40 banks at the moment collaborating, and they're not only working by themselves, but through UNEP-FI also they're working in partnership and together with a set of implementing partners. That includes Acclimatize, Oliver Wyman, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IASA, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, the IIF, the International Institute of Finance, Cicero, and many others. You also hear about insurance companies. Here we have 22 insurance companies collaborating with PricewaterhouseCoopers at the moment, and also the Sabin Center at Columbia University. Now, while all of this TCFD work and the current ongoing work on TCFD is groundbreaking, of course, in its own right, as David was pointing out, they are part of a wider UNEP-FI work program on climate change. And so the point of my intervention here is to give the wider overview. And I think if we can move to the next slide, please. Can we do that? Super, thank you. This is what you see here on the slide is that wider work program of UNEP-FI on climate change. And what's important to understand here is that climate change, like any other issue, and David, you said it already, will present to financial institutions, whether that's a bank, investor, insurer, in different forms or as different challenges. First, it will present itself as a risk. And here we're looking, of course, at both the so-called physical risks that climate change as a physical meteorological phenomenon presents to financial institutions, but we're also looking at the risks associated with the overall global effort to decarbonize the economy by 2050. Those are typically referred to as transition risks, as many of you will know. Secondly, climate change also manifests and presents itself as an opportunity to financial institutions. And these can be opportunities related to financing or perhaps to exposing oneself to climate change mitigation and the corresponding business models, the corresponding technologies there, as well as financing or exposing oneself as a financial institution to climate change adaptation and the corresponding business models and technologies that are relevant in that context. And lastly, but also importantly, climate change presents itself to financial institutions also in the form of a normative issue, demanding from FIs a certain stance on really their responsibility vis-a-vis this phenomenon and challenge. So something perhaps that goes beyond, a rather conventional and routine optimization and of risks and opportunities, and starts going into and asking the question, what is the purpose of financial institutions in society, and what is the purpose of financial institutions, vis-a-vis the key environmental challenges that we face. So here we have it. I could say the 3 R's. Perhaps we have risks for risks, returns for opportunities, and responsibility for this rather normative dimension of climate change and financial institutions. And beyond these 3 R's, of course, we still have the complexity of climate change presenting itself. I already alluded to this as a physical phenomenon, as something that is changing pretty rapidly the meteorological and hydrological patterns of the world that we need to adapt to. But also, on the other hand, it presents itself as a climate change mitigation problem, that technological and policy problem related to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to keep warming beneath a certain level. Now, this is really the context, and now we have here, as you can see, across the 3 financial industries, our TCFD work covering the 3 industries, and here really looking at risks and opportunities, assessing those, disclosing those, and doing so really at what is the cutting edge of innovation, and sophistication meaning doing so in scenario-based, forward-looking manners. Then we have our work on Paris, on aligning to the Paris Agreement, and this is the work that we do with a normative lens on, and here we're asking financial institutions and to commit themselves and to set targets to align their portfolios in their entirety with greenhouse gas emissions pathways that are consistent with the Paris Agreement, so consistent with pathways that are 2 degrees compatible. On alignment, we now have 2 platforms. We've got all financial institutions making such commitments. We have the institutional asset owners that are convened under the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance that we convene with the PRI. Currently, there are 24 asset owners there with 5 trillion in assets under management. But we also have on the banking side, under the Principles for Responsible Banking, the 37 banks that have made a collective commitment to climate action, which is a commitment to align loan books with greenhouse gas emissions pathways consistent with well below 2 degree by the end of the century. And then thirdly and lastly, we still have, in addition to the TCFD and to the Paris alignment work, there is a separate effort underway in partnership with the Global Center on Adaptation to really focus on physical climate change, on the need to mobilize financing for adaptation, and that's trying to answer the question, what is finance sector best practice and what is finance sector leadership on adaptation and on responding to physical climate change. I'll stop here. I had 2 more slides, David, but I don't think it's necessary now to go through this. So I think we can move on to the next agenda item. Thanks very much.
Great. Remco, thank you so much. And for those of you afterward, we will circulate them. So for Remco's other slides here, which I think provide some helpful definitions, but I think he really did a nice job of speaking to those. And so I'll move on and kind of dive into that first pillar that he referred to, which is the TCFD. And as mentioned, there are 2 ongoing pilots that we're in the process of executing on, as well as a couple new pilots that are on the horizon for the fall. And so we're really going to talk about the active work that is ongoing in the insurance and banking sectors. And to do that, my colleague Manuel will speak about insurance, and then I will give the overview of the banking program that we lead respectively. So with that, Manuel, I'll go to your first slide and let me know if you'd like me to progress them. Otherwise, please also feel free to share your screen.
Thank you, David. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to discuss the insurance pilot today. What I want to do today is give you an overview of our approach. We are about halfway through the project, and we are expecting to release the results really during Q4 of this year. So the work is in progress, but we have started to set up the framework and the way we think about the problem and analyze it. So the slide that's on your screen right now covers our objectives. So as this is the first phase 1 of the insurance TCFD pilot, the first pilot we're conducting in that space, we are still focusing on the building blocks, on development of the analytical building blocks to identify and quantify risks. So our key objectives are really threefold. One is to help develop methodologies to assess and disclose climate-related underwriting risks. And 2 is to contribute to the creation of harmonized approach to the disclosures. I will show that the general framework of risk assessment can be leveraged, and that's what we are trying to continue to work with in order to facilitate the integration in the insurance business. And one of the goals of TCFD is to also enable more efficient benchmarking across various businesses. So those two are really about bringing that to the table. And of course, signal the support of the FSB work on climate risk transparency from an insurance standpoint. Remco touched on the scope. The insurance industry is obviously quite familiar with physical risk, and in general, not just from a concept standpoint, but from an analytical standpoint. But here we are also very much interested in transition risk and as well as litigation risk. Litigation and liabilities are big deals in the context of many of the business operations. And so we are keeping an eye on that, looking particularly at what is going on today in the litigation space and how it relates to the insurance products. You can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as Remco mentioned, we have 22 companies, which represent about a bit more than 10% of the total industry premium and spread all around the globe. So we have a number of insurers in this region. We have 3 Japanese insurers on board and also 2 companies in Australia. I believe that some of the members directly involved in the project are on the call. So I want to give out a big thanks to all of them for the outstanding support that we have had so far in this project from them and the rest of the membership. The project is run in close partnership with those markets, and the goal is really to provide practical solutions that can be used not just by the members, but ultimately also by the market at large. So in the context of standardizing, as I said earlier. You can move to the next slide, please. So I did mention that we're starting with the general framework commonly used in the industry to think about risk problems, risk issues, emerging risk. And this slide shows exactly that structure in the pyramids type format. The first step is to identify risk, particularly from a standpoint of materiality, and then assess the risk, operationalize them in your strategies and in your day-to-day businesses, and ultimately disclose them. So this should, using this pyramid, using this standard approach, should really facilitate the integration of the class of risk in the business. As I said, it becomes essentially an extension to many of the existing and well-understood business principles, not just from an analytical standpoint, but at the business level, in how things are underwritten, in how the leadership team thinks about the issues. So that's what is appealing for us to start from that standpoint. Now, while the format works, there are a number of aspects where we diverge a bit. Number one, this is a forward-looking type of analysis. So we cannot rely solely on historical data, which is oftentimes the case when looking at insurance risk, because it enables this sort of set this ground rule that can be used to figure out how things change. Here, it's a combination of looking at recent experience, but also at what may happen far into the future. Number two, we need to set up temporal and context targets. And so that's also something that's different. So in our case, we are going to look at 10 years out, 20 years out, 30 years out, so really 2030 and 2050. And also we need to think about a pathway of 10 years. And that's something that's obviously not quite used in the standard risk management. And then the latter, which is maybe the more subtle here, is to think about risk in an interdependent type of approach. So what I mean by that is the actions that we are going to take in the next 5, 10, 15 years are going to really impact our transition risk position. But then that will later on, or at the same time and further to that, impact the position on the physical side. So thinking about physical risk in a dependent way is the starting point, but ultimately the context is also very important. And so we will use some of those different considerations in the way we analyze the problem in this pilot. So can you please move to the next slide? Okay, so on the risk identification front, so here, as I said, it's about setting the context and it's about setting materiality. So in the setting the context, we are looking at two time frame, and we are looking at a number of scenarios. So we start with RCP and IEA scenarios. And from a transition standpoint, we are looking at aggressive paths, or what should be the standard path, but still seen aggressive in many ways. A under 2 degree, well below 2 degree IEA scenario to get to, say, 1.5 degree difference of a pre-industrial standpoint or temperatures. And then in the context of that, we look at it in the next 10 to 15 years. On the physical side, we're looking farther out, really, to about 2050. And in that case, we take the worst case scenario, which is an RCP 8.5. And then to blend those two together, because they are interrelated, as I said, we are also bringing in a third scenario, the RCP 4.5, where there will be a certain level of transition, but also very measurable impacts on the physical side as we go forward. And across this entire spectrum, we do thread in litigation as we think through various business situations where the risk take place and involve. So that's the setting the context. On the materiality side, you have an illustration on this slide. It's really not final results. It's just to explain a bit the concept. We are using open source data so that everybody will be able to then reproduce what has been done to set real activities in risk at a global level. So looking at different time frames, looking at various hazards, looking at various transition cases over various lines of business to come up with a view of materiality forward in a number of aspects of the business, comprehensively across what the industry is doing. What I want to mention, though, is that this is one step of the process. Of course, it is important to start with the current risk levels, looking at an individual portfolio, where are the key risk zones, and then combine that with this sort of trend view over different timelines and over different pathways to really identify those core issues to dig deeper into. Please, can you change slide? Okay, so after this identification process, which tells you where to focus your resources more efficiently, the next step is the risk assessment process. And so the way we proceed with that is first qualitatively and then quantitatively. And so we've decided to focus on 5 key business scenarios and explore them all the way through. And so what you have on the map here are the 5 cases that we're looking at. We have 3 cases which start with a real physical issue behind them and 2 that start with a transition issue. So in Japan, we are looking at cyclones. And particularly, we're looking at that with, from a multi-risk standpoint, we're looking at storm surge, for example, and we are looking at both residential and some level of commercial impacts. Then in Australia, so also in the, broadly speaking, in the area, we're looking at transition from property standpoint. So in terms of housing and commercial buildings, how is the portfolio going to change? Construction type, maybe other aspects like that, footprint, where are the buildings being built, and how these may create, number one, opportunities, think about maybe infrastructure consideration, but also risks. And then beyond that, we are looking at flood, both in Canada and Europe. Why both? Because there are different considerations to it. In Canada, the problem is both inland with fresh water, but also coastal with tropical cyclones, so surge. And we're looking at that in the context of residential risk. And in Europe, flood is the interesting concept is to place that in urban areas. So we are evaluating flood in 2 different cities in Europe with different sort of societies and approach to the problem in terms of protections and other considerations. So those are our 5 cases. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper now into the Japanese case, which is on the next slide. Can you please move one slide? Thank you. So to give you a very high level sense of how we proceed about that. So the top level is the pathway through the elements that we need to look at. So we start with consideration of risk. So in that case, we are looking at Japan, as I said, wind and water consideration around cyclones. Then from there on, pick a sector. So it could be residential constructions. And then from there on, number 3, look at the implications for the insurance products. So how are the coverages functioning? How are the terms functioning on the contract and things like that? And then number 4 is projecting that into a financial framework. So now at the bottom, we are on the risk side, there's the opportunity obviously to look at 3 aspects. 1 is the hazard itself, how the wind is changing. 2 is changes in exposure, and 3 are changes in vulnerability. So in that case, as a starting point, we decided to work with hazard. Obviously, we are well aware that exposure is a driver of losses in tropical cyclone or in most catastrophes. So we are providing elements to that. But exposure changes whether the weather change or not, whether the climate evolve or not. The hazard itself is really the consideration that drives the climatic problem. Of course, some of the exposure trend may be a reflection of the changes in hazard, maybe how people are going to migrate and other considerations like that. But primarily the hazard is what we want to start with. Also in the context of disclosure, it's important to understand at the granular level what each aspect of the problem contributes to the result in order to have full control of what is happening. So that's on the risk side. Then at the sector level, considerations of changes in loss at the macro level, the geographic spread, how building react and what kind of damage is being observed. From a business line standpoint, it's where we come into consideration of modeling, exceedance probability, claims. We're looking at reinsurance as well, tail risk versus working layers and other considerations. When it comes to financial terms, so at the end, we are projecting all that into a financial impact through a model that PwC is building. And so some of the elements we look at, premiums, we are looking at change in premiums, or potential change in premiums, changes in loss ratio. The rest of it, reserve risk appetite, volatility, are considerations that are really more at the level of a company itself. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to summarize where we are at, I want to stress out again the fact that what is very critical is to look at the forward-looking type analysis here, and the case study is a way to focus then from a big picture to a small picture to a narrative of a situation that's unfolding in the business. What I like to sort of compare that to is a process that the company would go through when writing narratives in an ORSA, so on your own risk document. And those are generally a mix of weather, physical risk, but also economic risk. But we are thinking the same way. We're setting out the situation, and then we are looking qualitatively at what matters along the way, and then we are putting numbers on those pathways. What we are not doing yet is looking at life and health underwriting on the right side, for example. Another aspect that's interesting to consider is portfolio level analytics. What happens if you are not writing business just in Japan or just in Europe, but you're writing business on both sides of the planet, and those businesses are related? How do you deal with that in a disclosure environment or risk management environment? So that's another interesting component that we are looking at. And I think I'm going to leave it at this for now. I want to thank you again for your attention, and please don't hesitate to send us questions or connect later on if you have any further questions on this. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Manuel, for the overview of the work that you're doing, and I think it's really terrific, especially just with some of the global case studies that they're doing. That the program will really have broad applicability across the global investor landscape. So, so now to talk a bit about the banking pilot and specifically about the work that we are near concluding, but also to talk a little bit about how that work aspires to help institutions assess and ultimately disclose their climate risk. So to begin with, on back in 2018, UNEP-FI had launched a couple reports based on a year-long pilot, which we've now titled Phase 1, as we're now doing our next phase. So we've aptly titled this phase Phase 2. And in that first phase, we had 16 financial institutions accompanied by Oliver Wyman and Acclimatize, two consultancies, to assist us in developing methodologies for the assessment of physical and transition risks. What was really great about this work was the opportunity to have a co-creation of these methodologies. So not just to try out and demo tools, but to really solicit active guidance and active perspective from institutions on how they're currently thinking about their risks and measuring those risks, and how those things could be adapted and systematized into approaches that were repeatable as well as industry leading in their structure. And so I'll talk briefly about the transition approach, just in the way that it attempts to tie together some of the important elements of the financial sector with the existing climate science, and takes that approach and aims to integrate it. So just to give a little taste of that approach, the bedrock of that Phase 1 methodology was to look at scenarios from climate scientists who develop these integrated assessment models. So models that look at aspects of climate, models that look at aspects of energy systems, economics, and put those pieces together to create a future scenario. So using those scenario expectations around different temperature targets that we wanted to look at, so looking at the well below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, as well as the 2-degree scenario, and then a baseline scenario. We began with those and then continued into a broader exploration of scenarios. But ultimately, the information in those scenarios needs to be translated into something that is financially understandable and usable in thinking about credit quality. And so that's where what was developed was a sampling approach to not only break the portfolios into specific segments by sector, but to think about the different risk factors that drive pressure on each sector. And so specifically, these would be direct emissions costs, indirect emissions costs, so costs to the supply chain, low carbon capital expenditure, adaptations required to be compliant and consistent in a low carbon world, and then finally changes in revenue, to really think about what pressures there are both on the cost and the revenue side of a business. And then looking at several particular borrowers, the goal was to then use the results about them to extrapolate changes in credit ratings. So if a portion of the rating would be climate impacted because that rating is tied to, for a oil and gas company, tied to the price of petroleum, or whether it is tied to the overall demand for electricity in a region as a utility, or if it's tied to the costs associated with various important factor inputs. These are things that we would take from the scenario and look at how they would be impactful on a individual borrower level before then extrapolating back out to the segment. So the goal here is really to tie together institutions' own very bespoke and very individualized credit approaches with global and overarching climate science in a way not only to provide comparability, but also to provide a sense of understanding for the institution of how their current assets in their current portfolio fits within the context of a broader economic and broader climatic change. And so with building on that approach, in this current phase of work, we've aimed to really continue the knowledge building and understanding of scenarios by increasing the number of scenarios that we have looked at. So we've begun looking at things such as delayed policy scenarios. We've begun looking at low carbon dioxide removal scenarios, all with the idea that there are many potential futures, and being able to be a good risk manager and being able to seize the opportunities that come from them relies on a deep understanding of what those pathways could be and an ability to evaluate which ones you believe to be the most plausible ones. And so we've been working with the modeling teams, as Remco mentioned, both at the Potsdam Institute and at YASA, as well as with others across the industry to gain a deeper understanding of their scenario impacts. We've been looking to extend the methodologies, not only by developing a industry-wide heat map where the group of 40 institutions or 39 institutions is looking to specifically lay out what their view is on what risks exist both for physical and transition across sectors, so to get a more integrated approach, but also to develop a series of best practices around different sectors, and in that case to specifically cover a wider range of sectors than the first pilot did, with the hope not just of giving a view of a specific sector for each institution, but ultimately a portfolio view or an all-in view, which obviously is so critical when making strategic decisions about risk. And finally, with this approach, the goal is not to just have this be a regulatory exercise or a reporting exercise, but one that really is deeply integrated into the aspects of the business and into the aspects of the operations and strategy. And so thinking about what does good climate risk governance look like, and also when it comes to the TCFD disclosures, what are the best practices? What are the things that we need to be doing? And so we've been working now with the Institute for International Finance on developing a good practice template for the TCFD disclosures, as well as developing a hub for TCFD disclosures, where across the industry we'll be able to understand what common practices look like and help institutions benchmark against their peers. So I've mentioned a few of these things, but just as our program is coming to conclusion at the end of July, just to mention, we've been developing a physical risk blueprint, looking at a variety of different areas within physical risk that are really critical to understand and assess when evaluating the risks and opportunities. We've developed, in conjunction with Oliver Wyman, a transition risk web tool, which takes the methodology I was outlining for you and puts that online in a way that is repeatable and dynamic. So not only can institutions use not just one scenario, but a whole wide range of scenarios and understand the different variables and scenario assumptions. Beyond just that, it also provides a friendly user interface for conducting these risk assessments. We're putting together a few papers about the state of transition risk assessment also within the industry. So understanding how institutions use scenarios, understanding how they develop approaches to climate risk governance internally. Those are conversations that we are incorporating into our papers. And then finally, as I mentioned, that template and database. So a lot to come in the few months. And I think it also provides a really good springboard for the soon-to-be release of the NGFS scenarios. I'll talk a little bit more about that near the very end of our presentation, but I think it also provides a great springboard for our next phases of work in the sense that what we're really trying to do here as UNEP-FI is take the convening power of the United Nations and bring it together to help really all of the different key stakeholders here work together. I think there's few problems that demand more collaboration than climate. It's largely on account of the fact that we can't succeed unless we succeed together. And what that means is our role, we see, is to help the climate modelers produce models that are more knowledgeable and more in tune with what the financial industry needs, help regulators to understand the range of current practice within the industry, where capabilities exist and where their scenarios and regulations would be used. And then for institutions themselves to really be the cornerstone of our program, as we are a membership organization, help them build capacity not only to be more effective risk managers, but also better competitively adapted to take advantage of the changes, and also most importantly, to play a constructive and positive role in financing and fostering a transition to a low carbon economy. So with that in mind, to conclude, what I'll say is on the front of new pilots that we're looking at, to use those same pillars that I mentioned before of scenarios, of data and methodology, and reporting and governance. We're planning on having 2 new pilots in the fall, one which will be the next phase of the banking work, and one that will be the next phase of investor work that was previously concluded last year. And the goal, while each of them will have slightly different focuses, the goal is really to go deeper into scenarios, but not just the global scenarios, but really thinking in more regional ways, in more sectoral ways, giving people the expertise of what climate experts as well as what industry experts are saying about the pathway of transition and physical risks, to think about new methodologies on the insurance and banking sides that can integrate different types of risks together and can be able to produce a comprehensive estimate of what the total all-in risk is, whether that's transition or physical, or both together. And then finally, to really hammer home the idea that we need to have good processes in place, and we need to have disclosures that are both as comprehensive as they can be, while at the same time as comparable as they can be across institutions. So to continue pushing the industry to improve those disclosures, I think it's particularly good timing as our work with the IIF on those templates, which there will be one for investors as well as for banks, will be concluding as that pilot is getting underway. So I think we'll have a even greater arsenal of tools to take advantage of. So if you're interested in those pilots, or if you'd like to know more, I would be very glad to follow up with you over email. Just one quick question that I see before I move on to the next section. One is about one is just about the work that UNEP-FI is doing with other sectors, or UNEP more broadly. I think a lot of work is currently underway across the environment program more generally to work with helping sectors to transform and to reach a low carbon future. Obviously, as our focus is on the finance initiative, I think it's most sensible that that's where our focus relies. But I also think beyond that, it's a critical lever of the low carbon transition and the move to decarbonization, given that financial flows, not only as stated in Paris, but also from our own experience across the industry, play such a critical role, not only in the financing presently of emissions, but also the financing new technologies, of new innovations, of new renewables. And so in a lot of ways, what is being done in the financial industry has important and relational effects to the other sectors. And that's how I would refer to that. So as I said, concluding on our programs, we have a interesting ongoing relationship, a China and UK TCFD program. And I will let Ms. Yin Hong speak about that. So if you'd like, please feel free to share your screen. Otherwise, if you'd like to just unmute and speak about the program, we'd love to hear an update on that now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, we can hear you now. Perfect.
Yeah, I'm Yin Hong. I will share my PPT. I'm sorry. Wait. I'm sorry.
So if you'd like
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. So if you'd like to just share your screen.
Maybe some problem. I can't share my PPT. Could I speak firstly?
Yeah. Yes, please do that.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Yin Hong from ICBC. Good morning, everybody. I'm very honored to be here to share with everybody here about the practice of the pilot program of China-UK environmental and climate information disclosure. And I would like to speak three aspects. The first is background, and second is progress, and then third is case. For example, the ICBC. The first is background. On the ninth China-UK economic and financial dialogue on December 15, 2017, Chinese and British financial institutions were encouraged to conduct a pilot project on environmental information disclosure with reference to the TCFD framework. The GFC of China and the City of London jointly organized 10 Chinese and British financial institutions to jointly conduct the pilot project of environmental information disclosure. On the China side, according to the guideline for building a green financial system in 2016 from 7 ministry and commission, including PBRC, and the relevant requirement from CSRC and CBRC, etc. Pilot team of China side explored the role of environmental information disclosure. Different from the manufacturing corporation, we think financial institutions do not directly discharge pollutant to environment. So we think from financial institutions mainly centers on their assets. Secondly, environmental risk of financial institutions is mainly derived from the environmental risk of their manufacturers' clients. Thirdly, the financial institutions may promote the low carbon transformation of manufacturing through penetration management. And what is the environmental information disclosure of financial institutions? We think financial institutions' environmental information disclosure should include two aspects. First is information about impact of financial institutions on operations, investments, and financing activities on the environment. Second is information about impact of climate and environmental factors on opportunities and the risk of financial institutions. Why do financial institutions be willing to disclose their environmental information? We think there are mainly 6 reasons. First is regulator requirement. Second is responsibility, and third is the environmental risk. The fourth is to improve reputation, and the fifth is the market opportunity, and the sixth is accelerate the green economic development. Second, I will speak the progress of pilot work. And now the task force of China and UK pilot program, we have conducted a serious meeting and activities as following. I don't want to explain the detail. There are 3 mainly progress I would like to say. The first is the pilot team worked out an action plan and worked out a framework and issued the three annual progress report. First is the action plan. For example, the action plan of Chinese pilot commercial bank. There are three phases of action plan. The action plan, the first phase is the pilot banks disclose impact of the 2018 green credit by the CBRC standard on the environment. There are 2 aspects information should disclose. The first is qualitative indicators, and the second is quantitative indicators. The qualitative indicators includes governance, strategy, policy, risk management, green finance innovation, practice cases, study results, annual achievements, etc. And second quantitative indicator includes green credit balance, proportion of green income, and other business indicators, and environmental beneficiaries indicators should also disclose. They include 7 indicators. For example, just the carbon dioxide emission reduces, green operations indicators, carbon emission, etc. And phase two is on the basis of phase 1 disclose scenario analysis and stress tests on impact from environmental factors on credit risk are conducted with relevant information disclosed. And phase 3, on the basis of phase 2 disclosure, pilot banks are encouraged to expand the scenario analysis and stress tests on the environmental impact from environmental factors on credit risk. Pilot team also worked out the framework based on the international experience and the situation in China. ICBC drafted the framework of objective of UK-China environmental information disclosure. As you see on this slide, objective include the content and answered what should you disclose and how to do you disclose. Up to now, the pilot team has issued 3 annual progress report. 3 progress report. And the pilot project also has made other great progress. The first is the group of pilot institutions have been expanded. So far, the number of pilot institutions has increased from 10 to 30. The total assets of Chinese pilot institutions are approximately 50 trillion RMB. Second, the codification capability has been improved. And third, the disclosure has been started. Part of the banking financial institution disclosed the information in the form of independent reports, including ICBC, Ping An Group, and Bank of Huzhou, and some chose to disclose the information in the social responsibility reports. And fourth, its influence has been increased. We are very excited to see the following facts. The first is the pilot zones for green finance reform and innovations promoted the information disclosure by referring the framework of the pilot program. And second, the standards for environmental information disclosure has been initiated. Assigned by the PBRC, the formulation of the Guide to Environmental Information Disclosure of Financial Institutions led by ICBC with the participation of industrial banks and the China Emission Exchange. Now, the application for the guide has been approved. The third, ICBC participated in the discussion of the international standards. ICBC participated in the discussion of the standard ISO 322 sustainable finance. And we have got some experience of the pilot work. The first is that there are great difference between the objective and the contents of environmental information disclosure by different kinds of financial institutions. For example, banking, security, and the other kind of the financial institution has a great difference. The second, large financial institution have a stronger capability in environmental information disclosure, while the capability of middle and small financial institutions should be strengthened. Third, compare with the labeling of green credit and the environmental benefit assessment, it's more difficult to conduct scenario and analysis and stress test. The fourth, the data for disclosure and the system building need continued improvement. Some suggestions for the pilot work. First is explore and set up framework of environmental information disclosure by financial institution. And second is conduct in-depth research and analysis of the impact of environmental and climate factors and financial institutions. And the third is quantitatively analyze the impact of investment and financial institutions and climate and environment. And the fourth, the demonstration effect can be generated through the leading disclosure by financial institution of the pilot of UK-China environmental information disclosure. Okay, the final part is the case of ICBC. ICBC in 2019, ICBC formulated and published special report on green finance for the first time in accordance with its own status. On the right of slide, you can see the report. The report comprehensively introduced the practice and achievements in green finance of the bank in 2018 from the following aspects: strategy and governance, policy and procedure, green products, green operations, green researches, and green awards and honors. For example, ICBC's continuously to establish their green finance system. The core is to integrate green factors into the bank's operation and the management system, include strategy, policy, procedure, management process, and products management and capability building. We disclose ICBC our green credit on this slide shows as at the end of December 2019, the balance of green credit of ICBC was 1.3 trillion RMB, which was the growth rate was 9% around 2 percentage points higher than the growth rate of corporate loan balance of the same period. The next slide, the next two slides is some data of the green business indicator and the environmental beneficial indicators. This is our disclosure. ICBC has also to do some green finance research on the GFC. Because the time is limited, so I think I will stop my speech here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really interesting and helpful update, and as you can see, things are developing rapidly, and one of the important things is also to think about just how the industry can align and not only do programs like this across nations, but really regionally and globally. And I think one of the keys to that is around good definition and around good targets. And so I'm really pleased to have Alexander from the WWF talk a bit about their science-based targets initiative and some of the work that they're doing, which I think is really crucial to these questions around disclosure and the TCFD ultimately.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm afraid I can't really share anything at the moment. So I think Dennis, maybe the previous speaker needs to stop sharing the slides. Now that should work. Let me. So thanks everybody for your time and thanks for the introduction, David. I'll just speak a little bit about the Science-Based Targets Initiative and how it tries to catalyze climate action that's aligned with climate science by the private sector. And I'm Alex Farzan. I work in WWF's Paris office and I'm part of the global climate and energy practice. And I'd like to start the presentation with this little picture riddle, really. And what you're seeing is on the left side, New York City, Fifth Avenue on Easter morning in 1900. The game that we're playing is Spot the Car. And to allow you to do that quickly, there's actually a visual aid in the form of a red circle that helps you see the one car that is on the street, and all the other vehicles are actually horse carriages. And then on the right side, you see the very same street in the very same city, just 13 years later. And of course, now you don't need a visual aid for spotting the cars. In fact, there's no horse carriages left. And I think this is a really powerful metaphor for the role businesses play in climate change. On the one hand, of course, and perhaps the most obvious aspect of this is that the modern economy is entirely reliant on fossil fuels, and businesses have spread that fossil fuel economy into every corner. And that's reflected in some key statistics. For example, the value chains of the 100 most polluting companies account for almost 70% of global emissions. So there's a huge responsibility for what drives climate change. But on the other hand, and perhaps less obvious on first sight, it's that businesses have the power to be part of the solution. It's incredible that within 13 years, in the largest city of the world, the dominant mode of transport for hundreds of years has been completely displaced by new technology. That's testament to the power of businesses to innovate and then to deploy that innovation at scale. And if we want to tackle the climate crisis, we will need to make use of that engine of innovation and scale and point in the right direction to make sure that it's part of the solution. And this is what the Science-Based Targets Initiative tries to do. It tries to give businesses the tools to align their business with a low carbon future, to point their engine of innovation in the right direction. And we do that by encouraging businesses to set science-based targets. And those are climate targets that translate the knowledge from climate science and scenarios to the level of an individual company, and ultimately helps them understand how much do I have to reduce my emissions, how quickly to contribute my share to the goals of the Paris Agreement. So from the climate scenarios that the IPCC has collated from worldwide science groups, we actually know quite clearly how quickly we have to reduce our emissions globally to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, or to have a good chance of meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the Science Based Targets Initiative breaks that down for individual businesses. The SBTI, short for Science Based Targets Initiative, is a collaboration between CDP, the UN Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and WWF. And we try to promote science-based targets to businesses and enable them to target really in three ways. On the one hand, we develop methods and guidance and tools to enable businesses to set these science-based targets. We promote science-based targets as a powerful way of future-proofing businesses' growth and as a clear yardstick to understand how a business must transition to contribute to the goals of the Paris Agreement, but also how to fit in the low carbon economy that is coming. I'm sorry, I'm getting a lot of background noise. If everybody could please mute themselves if they're not speaking, then that would be hugely appreciated. We also promote these to, for example, regulators and to investors, because as I'm sure you've heard about today, there's a strong awareness for the risks businesses and the financial system are exposed to from climate change. And one of those risks is the transition risk. So those risks that business models are exposed to as the global economy transitions to low carbon model. And while having a science-based target isn't a perfect answer to whether or not a business is taking transition risk serious, it is a very good point to start to understand whether a business understands how its emission profile fits into low carbon economy. And then finally, we validate targets. So we have an independent assurance mechanism where businesses can submit their targets to the Science Based Targets Initiative, and we provide them with a stamp of approval if they meet a number of criteria. So how can businesses join the Science Based Targets Initiative? It's a relatively easy to understand four-step model. First, businesses can commit publicly to setting a science-based target. And that is quite easy. It's just sending a letter that makes this public commitment, and they will show up on our website and be notified or acknowledged as a business that has the intention of setting a science-based target. Understanding that it often takes some time to go through the required technical steps of setting a science-based target. They then have 2 years to develop these targets. And they can use our resources and guides to go through these steps. We'll talk a little bit about what the technical side of that is in a moment. And they can then submit their targets to the SBTI and finally announce their targets if they could get that stamp of approval through an independent assurance mechanism. And we're making good progress in, sorry, I'm going to switch this. We're making good progress in having businesses join the initiative. So since we launched just before the Paris COP in 2015, over 880 businesses have joined the SBTI. Over 30 businesses are now joining us per month. So actually very positively, I can also report that the current economic and health crisis has not necessarily slowed that down. We do see continued engagement from businesses, and over 360 of these businesses already have had their targets approved. And we're really talking about a lot of large world-leading businesses. So just the direct emissions from these business operations are larger than the emissions of the economies of France and Spain. And if you take the targets that they've set for the entire value chains, they now cover emissions equivalent to the emissions of the European Union. So we're really seeing this strong movement of leadership from the private sector. And it's a global movement. Also, I think it's also important to acknowledge that there's some discrepancy in where we've seen the strongest pickup. So we've seen very good penetration and pickup from companies in North America, in Europe, and in East Asia. And perhaps a little bit less strong uptake in some of the other regions of the world. Also, I think it's important to acknowledge that there's first movers in a lot of other countries, notably in India. We've seen a strong surge, and in Latin America. So what does it actually mean to set a science-based target? How does it work? It's a relatively straightforward three-step process. Also, there's, as you will appreciate, some technical detail behind it. The first step is understanding what is the global carbon budget that we have left. And again, the IPCC scenarios help us understand this. So if we're saying that we want to hit, for example, a 1.5-degree target of global warming as enshrined in the Paris Agreement, climate scenarios can give us a clear understanding of how quickly we have to reduce our global emissions to make sure we don't exceed the concentrations in the atmosphere that would lead to this temperature goal. And that's commonly referred to as a carbon budget. So you draw on certainly, in some sense, a budget that you can draw on over time. So once you understand what the carbon budget is, the key step for a company to understand is what part of this global carbon budget is actually my share. Like how much can I emit over time to make sure I don't exceed my contributions? And we have some allocation mechanisms, some methods that help a company understand that. And then the third step, of course, is understanding how it compares to a company's current performance. So from your current emissions, how fast do you have to reduce by how much to understand whether you fit in that budget or not, and whether your reduction rates are actually aligned with climate scenarios. There's two principal ways of allocating these methods, and I'm sorry, allocating this carbon budget, and I'm sorry I don't have time today to go into a lot of detail, but in principle, we have one sector agnostic method that allocates emissions based on global reduction rates. So it essentially assumes that every actor within the economy needs to, from their current starting point, reduce at a similar rate. And its absolute emissions are reducing over time at a rate equivalent to the rate that we as a global economy need to reduce. And that's certainly true for scope 1 and 2 emissions, which is the technical jargon for emissions from your operations, so from electricity use, from fossil fuel use directly within your business boundaries. And we also have methods for companies to set targets for the scope 3 emissions. And those are the emissions that are linked to a business that are happening outside of the direct operations. So upstream in your supply chain, from the goods and raw materials and the transport that happens as goods and services are purchased by your business and then processed, as well as downstream from the energy or emissions that are occurring from the products you might be producing, and a number of other categories. So if you are unfamiliar with that language and interested, I would recommend you look up the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Accounting Standards, who essentially are the most prominent global rulebook for how these emissions are accounted. These sector-agnostic methods can be used currently by all companies, except for financial institutions and oil and gas companies. I'll speak in a moment about why that is. And so we have this one sector-agnostic approach, which frankly is the most used approach. Most businesses just understand that we have a global reduction that we need to meet and set targets using these methods. But we do also have sector-specific methods. Most notably, a sectoral decarbonization approach, SDA, that was developed for the SBTI, which provides sectoral decarbonization pathways, primarily leaning on data by the International Energy Agency and the models they provide. And those actually break down the global budget to a sector level and then allocate it out within those individual sectors. And we currently cover a number of heavy industry sectors, the power sector, real estate, the ICT sector, and some transport sectors. And we continue to refine these on an ongoing basis. And we're also currently developing more bespoke sector approaches for some of the key sectors, like oil and gas, for forestry, land, and agriculture, and for financial institutions, probably particularly relevant for the audience here. And why we're developing these bespoke methods is because these sectors have very specific needs to express what it means to have a science-based target. So for financial institutions, it's obviously a slightly different approach that you need to take to cover the impact of the lending and investment activities than for some of the other sectors that have a more direct relationship with the emissions that they're responsible for. I've only had 10 minutes today, so this is all I can present today. But if you are interested in learning more, I'd really encourage you to visit us on sciencebasedtargets.org, and we'll be and get in touch with us through that, and be very happy to answer any questions and provide input. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. Really terrific initiative. And as I said, I think there's a ton of complementarity and commonality with the TCFD in the sense that it's really critical that we speak a common language when it comes to these important topics. So recognizing that we only have a few minutes left, what I will do to conclude is I will just talk briefly about a few of the things that are happening on the regulatory front that I think are of highest relevance. If I could just have the presenter, the screen share back to be able to do that, that would be great. If not, I'll just voice these thoughts over. To just conclude with a few thoughts then on regulation, I think that what we've seen with COVID has been that this is not something that is going to stop climate movement and climate momentum, and in many cases may create the financial need and economic conditions that, as Eric mentioned at the beginning, are going to drive a green recovery and drive a faster transition ultimately. Obviously, there's some potential risks and potential headwinds, but from our perspective, the way we're seeing regulators look at this is to see increasing ambition. Many of the stress testing initiatives that we saw being rolled out in the beginning of 2020 may be somewhat delayed due to the unique circumstances, but we're certainly experiencing a situation here where we're seeing not only more jurisdictions from Singapore to the UK launching stress tests, as well as countries from Australia to Canada adding and thinking about the potential for doing so. But ultimately, we have also further guidance, not just from individual regulators, but from that collective body, that Network for Greening the Financial Services, which last month issued a status report on green versus brown assets and the difference in risks, which I think is a good companion piece to some work that the EU had done in thinking about benchmarking with the green taxonomy. And then subsequently, the NGFS also provided some guidance on regulation or on how regulators should be thinking about and assessing climate risk. And this month, we're looking forward to and expecting a set of scenarios from them that will be reference scenarios. Happily, within our program is using very much the same scenarios that NGFS is likely to draw from, in the sense that we're both working with the Potsdam Institute and YASA. And so here on this final page, you can see a little bit about what those reference scenarios look like. But what we really see in the future is additional systematic assessments of the health of the financial sector, as well as individual companies. And then finally, what you see is a likelihood to have an increased reliance on scenarios, as well as an increased demand for deeper assessments within different sectors as well. And so I think that, as we've mentioned through the course of this webinar, the programs that we are working toward and the initiatives that our partners and those in the industry are supporting are really aimed at giving institutions the opportunity to understand these scenarios better, understand what is coming from a risk regulatory and opportunity perspective, and to have the tools to act on it strategically. So we're very eager to continue the conversation with you, whether you are a member or just an interested financial institution. As I mentioned previously, going back a little bit to the new pilots, if you're interested in those, please reach out to me. If you have any questions about anything that was discussed during this webinar, please also reach out, and we'd be very keen to connect you with the right resource, either within UNEP-FI or within any of the partners that we're working with on an ongoing basis. So thank you so much. I'll look forward to speaking with many of you soon, and please stay well. Thank you.